Hey, what's up guys? Hope you're doing good wherever you are. Today I'm back at it again with another VRAM comparison. Just 2 weeks ago, Nvidia launched a 3GB version of the GTX 1060 and in the process confused us all. The reduced memory capacity isn't particularly confusing, rather it's the change in core configuration that has many more than a little baffled. Despite being built upon the same GP106 architecture as the full-fat GTX 1066GB, the new 3GB model has an SM unit disabled. This takes the total CUDA core count from 1280 down to 1152, a 10% reduction. As a result, there are also 10% fewer texture mapping units as well. Although the memory capacity is being reduced, the memory subsystem remains much the same, using GDDR5 memory clocked at 2000 MHz for a bandwidth of 192GB. So despite physically changing the core configuration, the name remains exactly the same. Of course, Nvidia has done this in the past. Way back in 2006, they released the 8800 GTS with 640MB of VRAM, only to release a 320MB version with the same name the following year, which was then followed by a 512MB version, again with the same name. In my opinion, the 3GB GTX 1060 should be known as the 1060 GS or perhaps even the GTX 1050 Ti. Anyway, it's not, so it's important to understand what the difference between the two GTX 1060 models is. Other than the downgraded specifications just mentioned, the other change has to do with the price. There is of course some good news here, as the 3GB model features an MSRP of just $200, placing it head to head with the 4GB RX 480, that is, if you're able to find AMD's new mid-range contender. According to Nvidia, the cut down 3GB model should only be about 5% slower. Given it's losing just 10% of its shader, texture and geometry capacity with none of the rasterization capacity, this doesn't seem unrealistic. That said, this has been something I've been wanting to test for myself, and finally I have that chance. The biggest question mark regarding performance is that limited 3GB memory capacity. For a GPU capable of delivering GTX 980-like performance, we wonder how much of a handicap this limited memory buffer will be. Therefore, we'll be comparing the 3GB and 6GB models at the default Nvidia clock speeds, which sees both models running a base clock of 1506 MHz with a boost clock of 1708 MHz. Benchmarking takes place at 1440p and most games have been tested using the maximum in-game quality settings. Given the 3GB model features 10% less cores, we'll be looking out for margins greater than this when analysing the impact the memory buffer has on performance. Once again, my standard Core i7 benchmark rig has been used for testing, and this will help to eliminate any potential system bottlenecks that could shape the results. As we've found in the past, The Witcher 3 isn't a big VRAM user, and in our tests we only saw up to 2.3GB allocated. This meant the 3GB model wasn't disadvantaged by its memory capacity. Impressively, it was just 4% slower than the fully fledged 6GB model. The performance of the GTX 1060 3GB was on par with the Radeon RX 480. Overwatch is another game that isn't a heavy VRAM user, and as a result, the 3GB 1060 is just 6% slower when comparing the average frame rate. For those of you looking to spend most of your time playing games such as Overwatch, the 3GB model will be the most cost-effective option it seems. Grand Theft Auto was benchmarked with the advanced graphics option disabled along with MSAA. Still, everything else was maxed out and this pushed memory usage as high as 2.9GB, which obviously wasn't an issue for the 3GB 1060. Once again, the 3GB model was just 6% slower. Memory allocation in Deus Ex Mankind Divided crept just above 3GB to reach 3.1GB. Despite that, the 3GB 1060 hung in there. This time it was 8% slower on average, while the frame time performance didn't suffer. Star Wars Battlefront consumed up to 3.5GB of VRAM in our tests, and again, despite that, the frame time performance of the 3GB 1060 didn't suffer. This time, the 3GB model was on average just 7% slower. We know Doom kills graphics cards with less than 2GB of VRAM, but it seems 3GB is enough. Here, the 3GB 1060 was just 4% slower than the 6GB model when running the game in OpenGL. Switching to Vulkan provided similar margins between the two 1060 graphics cards. That said, the 3GB model is now 6% slower. Memory allocation maxed out at 3.7GB in the Division, but again, this didn't appear to have a negative impact on the 3GB 1060 and its limited VRAM capacity. The 3GB model was just 7% slower on average, while the frame time data looked good too. Benchmarking with Batman Arkham Knight saw memory allocation creep up to 4.1GB, and this did start to impact the 3GB 1060 in a negative way. Although it was on average just 9% slower, it took a serious nosedive in the frame time results. The 1% time result saw the 3GB model trail by 17%, and then 19% for the 0.1% time result. The game was noticeably smoother on the 6GB 1060, but it has to be said the experience on the 3GB model was still very good. First we tested Far Cry Primal with the high quality settings, though please note the HD texture pack was also installed and enabled. As a result, the game allocated up to 4GB of VRAM in our test. Oddly, this didn't appear to impact the frame time performance of the 3GB 1060, though it was 9% slower for the average frame rate. Now with the ultra quality preset enabled, the average frame rate is just 7% lower for the 3GB 1060. The frame time data is weaker now, but not to the degree where stuttering became an issue. The 3GB 1060 was 8% slower than the 6GB model when comparing the average frame rate, while it was just 6% slower for the 1% time data. Testing Assassin's Creed Syndicate using the high quality preset never saw memory allocation exceed 3.4GB. Increasing the image quality preset to very high boosted memory allocation to 4.3GB, but this didn't appear to have a noticeable impact on the 3GB 1060. It still trailed the 6GB model by an 8% margin. Mirror's Edge Catalyst is another memory-hungry game, though despite seeing memory allocation rise as high as 4.5GB, the 3GB 1060 was only ever 6% slower. Increasing the quality to hyper, we see a massive decline in performance of the 3GB 1060 as memory allocation climbs to 5.1GB. The 3GB model is now 41% slower than the fully fledged 6GB 1060, and with an average frame rate of 22 FPS, the game is clearly unplayable. Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor is odd in the sense that we see a huge amount of allocation with very little impact on performance. The 3GB 1060 was just 8% slower than the 6GB model, despite memory allocation reaching 5.4GB. Finally, we have Rise of the Tomb Raider, and here memory allocation hits an insane 7.7GB. Naturally, you'd expect that to completely cripple the 3GB 1060, but that wasn't really the case. The 3GB model was 10% slower, but given the conditions and the difference in core configuration, that's a very respectable result for the cut-down GTX 1060 graphics card. Nvidia claimed that the 3GB GTX 1060 would be 5% slower than the 6GB model, and for the most part, that's pretty accurate. If we exclude the hyper-quality Mirror's Edge Catalyst test, the 3GB model was an average 7% slower in the 13 games tested. Adding in the massive deficit seen in Mirror's Edge Catalyst pushes the margin out to 9%. I have to admit, I found these results a little surprising. Personally, I was expecting the 3GB model to struggle a little more at 1440p, especially with such high quality settings in play. With the exception of 2 games, the 3GB 1060 performed admirably. The Mirror's Edge Catalyst Hyper test is almost irrelevant given there's almost no difference in image quality between the Hyper and Ultra settings. Dropping the setting back to Ultra saw the 3GB 1060 become very competitive and even matched the frame time performance of the bigger 6GB model. The only other game to present an issue was Batman Arkham Knight, and while the 3GB 1060 did deliver perfectly playable performance here, the frame time results did fall away a bit. Beyond that, the 3GB 1060 was around 6 to 8% slower in virtually every title tested, making an exceptional value given it cost 20% less. Those of you looking for an affordable graphics card for 1440p gaming shouldn't dismiss the 3GB 1060. I can't say with any degree of certainty how this card will look compared to the 6GB model in a year's time. However, right now, based on the evidence at hand, there's very little difference between the two. For 1080p gamers, the choice seems more obvious. Save the money and get the 3GB model. I can't imagine even in a year's time that 3GB 1060 will suffer at this res. As a side note, once the GTX 1060 3GB and RX 480 4GB graphics cards are readily available at the $200 MSRP, we're going to have a real battle on our hands. Looking through the data, the two certainly traded blows and overall delivered very similar performance. What did you guys think of these results? Are you considering the 3GB 1060? Let me know in the comments. I'm your host Matt as always, and I'll see you guys next time. YouTubers like me depend on your support to continue improving the quality and content of our videos. To support the channel directly, consider becoming a patron to also get access to a heap of cool rewards and exclusive giveaways. Also, don't forget you can check prices and buy the products I looked at in this video through the Amazon links in the video description below. Thank you kindly for supporting me and the Hardware Unboxed channel. It means a lot to me and I really do appreciate it, and in return I'll continue to work as hard as I can to keep producing the content you enjoy.